The Clarke family arrived at Nullarbor farm just before dusk, their car trailing dust along the long gravel road that cut through the remote Australian plains. To David, the land seemed vast enough to swallow their pain. To Emily, it was a final chance to mend the fractures growing silently between them. And to 7-year-old Lucy, still mourning her older brother's absence with a kind of quiet, internal ache, it was simply a new place, wide, strange, and humming with things unsaid. The farmhouse stood squat and weathered, its wooden bones groaning as the wind ran its fingers across the windowsills. As they unloaded boxes and made beds, the silence of the land pressed against them thick, watchful, and unsettlingly still. That first night, Emily fell asleep early, drained from the drive. David stayed up in the living room, idly sorting tools and double-checking the windows. But it was Lucy who first noticed it. At 2:17 a.m., the radio in the kitchen, an antique set left by the previous owners, sputtered to life. It wasn't plugged in, yet it played. A warbled waltz tune leaked from the speakers, fragile and faded like a memory trying to survive. Lucy climbed from her bed and padded barefoot through the hallway, drawn not by fear, but by an eerie kind of familiarity. She found the kitchen bathed in moonlight and sat on the floor, listening to the ghost song sway through the quiet. Through the window above the sink, she looked out toward the sheepfold, a crooked wooden structure just past the paddock fence. In the silver wash of moonlight, something moved, a shape, a woman, standing still. Pale, long-haired, and oddly blurred at the edges, like heat shimmer or fog. Lucy tilted her head and watched. The figure did not wave or smile, she simply stood, then vanished. The next morning, Lucy told her parents what she had seen. David gave her a tired smile, the kind parents use when they want to protect more than they want to believe. Emily said it was probably a dream, but David's smile faltered when Lucy began to hum the same strange tune that had played from the radio note for note. He'd heard it too, and he remembered that the radio had no power source. That night, he examined it, still unplugged, still lifeless. But something inside him stirred an old investigator's instinct. It had been nearly a year since he'd left the force. Since the funeral, since the silence set in, he hadn't wanted to dig again, but Nullarbor farm was already whispering. And the wind carried stories. Lucy would say later that she wasn't afraid. The woman had simply stood there watching, not angry, not cruel, just waiting. Like someone long forgotten, finally being seen. And in that first night at Nullarbor, the past began to rise. The following days brought strange signs. David tried to convince himself it was the land settling, the wind, or Lucy's imagination, but something about Nullarbor farm wasn't resting easy. On the second morning, he discovered deep, fresh cow tracks weaving through the dewy grass of the southern paddock wide apart. Heavy impressions, but they stopped abruptly halfway across the field, as if the animal had vanished mid-step. There were no cows. None had been delivered yet. The tracks returned the next morning, this time circling the old well. Emily dismissed it as residual markings from the previous owners, but David knew better. He had tracked people in worse conditions through worse terrain. These tracks were new, precise. Lucy became quieter, but not withdrawn. She spoke with calm certainty, as if she knew something no one else did. She spent hours sitting on the porch facing the sheepfold, head tilted, lips moving as if in conversation. Her drawings, once full of color and family scenes, shifted. One sketch showed a faceless woman in a feathered dress, standing behind wooden slats. Another depicted the sheepfold at night, shadowed and cracked. In each, Lucy had drawn music notes floating from the windows. David's unease grew when he caught her humming the waltz again, this time in her sleep. He inspected the radio once more, still unplugged, still untouched. Yet every night, exactly at 2:17 a.m., the same melody leaked from its speakers. One night, he waited for it sitting at the kitchen table, cup of coffee in hand, flashlight on standby. When the clock clicked over, the radio crackled to life. Static at first, then that same mournful waltz. The melody scraped gently at something inside him, sorrow maybe, or memory. He checked the outlet. No power. Lucy wandered in not long after. She looked at him, then the radio, and said, "She sings it when she's lonely." David's blood turned cold. "Who?" "The woman in the sheepfold," Lucy replied. "She waits until everyone's asleep. Then she sings to the sheep. But they're not really sheep." "What are they then?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lucy paused. "I think they used to be people." That night, Emily confessed she hadn't been sleeping well. She'd heard whispering while bathing. Like someone calling her name from beneath the floorboards, she blamed it on stress, the move, Lucy's dreams. But when she mentioned the name Margaret, David snapped to attention. "Lucy said that name yesterday," he told her. "Margaret, the woman in the sheepfold." Emily frowned. She's never heard that name before, has she? They both fell silent. The farm was growing louder in its own way, not with noise, but with signs. David's instincts sharpened. He had left his badge behind in the city, but the investigation had followed him here. Or maybe it had been waiting all along. One night later, standing by the well, David muttered aloud, "What happened here?" The wind shifted, the sheepfold creaked. And somewhere near the house, the radio began to hum. By the end of their first week at Nullarbor farm, David couldn't ignore the patterns forming around them. As the radio played each night without power and Lucy's drawings grew darker, he turned to what he trusted: records, archives, and patterns left behind by the living. He drove into the nearest town, a place that looked like it hadn't aged in decades, and asked the local council for any public information on the property. The clerk hesitated, mumbled about a long time ago, then disappeared into a back room with a flickering light. What David found chilled him. Old newspaper clippings, yellowed and fragile, told of a family that once lived on Nullarbor farm, the Burrows. A fire in 1987 had destroyed the sheepfold and partially collapsed the southern paddock fencing. 3 bodies were recovered from the remains. 2 were identified, a couple in their 40s. The third was listed only as a female in her 20s, no name. No family came forward. One article included a photograph of the farm, pre-fire, and there in the background stood the old well. In front of it, barely visible, a pale woman in a white dress stared at the camera. Her face was smudged, blurred either by the photo's decay or something else. Beneath it was scribbled, "Margaret?" David returned home uneasy. That night, Lucy refused to sleep. She sat on the porch in her pajamas, whispering to the sheepfold, her feet rhythmically tapping the wood as if marking time. Emily joined David in the kitchen, whispering that she was beginning to hear things too. The bathwater had run cold despite the boiler being on. The mirror fogged even when the air was dry. And someone kept calling her name from the empty hallway. "I thought I was dreaming," she said. "But it's the same voice, every time." David didn't tell her yet about Margaret, about the fire, about the nameless woman. Instead, he went to the fireplace, the oldest structure in the farmhouse. Something had been nagging at him since they moved in. Behind the bricks was an unusual hollow. With a chisel and flashlight, he removed a loose panel. Inside was a cloth-wrapped bundle, a diary. The first entry read, "My name is Margaret. They say I am ill. I hear what they don't. The sheep carry voices at night. I sing so they won't scream." Entry after entry detailed a slow unraveling not of madness, but of fear. Margaret wasn't delusional. She was terrified. Her family kept her inside, barred her from the paddocks, and refused to believe her when she said the well was whispering. The final entry was just 3 lines. "He took the children to the well. He told me to hush. But the water never forgets." David stared at the words until they blurred. Then he turned toward the dark window. The well waited at the edge of the property, half swallowed by weeds. And for the first time, he realized something wasn't haunting them. It was trying to be found. The morning after discovering Margaret's diary, David barely touched his coffee. The entries replayed in his mind, like the radio's waltz, over and over, each word heavier than the last. Emily noticed the shift. He didn't need to tell her. She had seen the darkness settle in his eyes. And she had her own secret. The voice whispering from the hallway now echoed with a child's voice. Soft. Familiar. David made up his mind that day. He gathered tools, rope, a lantern. He told Emily he was checking the fencing. He told Lucy to stay inside. But as he walked toward the overgrown well, his thoughts were already beneath the ground. Something had been buried there by fear, by force, by silence. And Margaret's final entries left no doubt. The truth lay below. The stone well stood like a scar at the edge of the paddock. Moss crept along its edges. Its wooden lid, cracked and bowed from age, came off with a reluctant groan. The air that escaped was cold, not just with depth, but with the stillness of something long sealed. David dropped the lantern in first. It swung on its rope, casting flickers across slick stone. He tied himself off and began to descend. 2 meters down, his boots scraped something solid. The floor wasn't mud, it was compacted earth, tamped unnaturally smooth. He knelt and began to dig with his hands. Within minutes, his fingers struck bone. At first he thought it might be an animal, but the shape of the jaw, the curve of the ribs, human. And not just one. As he unearthed more, he found 3 sets of remains, 1 adult and 2 much smaller, children. He stumbled back against the wall, bile rising in his throat. The voices above the well shifted, Emily screaming his name, and Lucy's small silhouette racing toward the pit. David surfaced to find both of them pale, shaking. "I told you not to go down," Lucy said, eyes shining. "She said it would hurt you." "Who?" David asked, though he already knew. Lucy looked toward the sheepfold. "The woman who sings to the bones." That night, the police came. David didn't care about hiding anymore. He handed over the diary, the remains. He told them everything. The detectives looked disturbed, but not doubtful. One of them, a weathered local, said the Burrows family's disappearance had always felt staged. Now they had proof. The fire, the radio, the cover story. The farm had buried them in more than one way. Inside the house, Emily sat holding Lucy, who seemed almost peaceful. "She doesn't need to sing anymore," the girl whispered. She said someone finally heard her. David stepped out to the porch alone. The land was quiet. The radio didn't play. For the first time since arriving at Nullarbor, the silence felt like release, not dread. But deep beneath the paddock, the ground still hummed faintly. The well had given up its truth. But not everything that rises stays quiet for long. In the days following the discovery, Nullarbor Farm became the epicenter of a quiet storm. Forensics confirmed what David already knew. 3 individuals, an adult woman, and 2 children had been buried decades ago. Though their identities couldn't be confirmed by DNA, the evidence told a damning story. Margaret had never been mad. She had been silenced. The Burrows family, desperate to hide what they had done, orchestrated a lie, that Margaret had set the fire, that the children were lost in the blaze, and that they had fled out of fear. In truth, it was a murder buried in dirt, rewritten with fire. The authorities wrapped the case in headlines that felt sanitized, "Cold case solved," after 35 years. But for David, for Emily, and especially for Lucy, the story was far from clean. They didn't leave the farm immediately. Strangely, the land no longer frightened them. The radio never played again, not even a crackle. The well remained uncovered, now surrounded by police tape and silence. The sheepfold, once Lucy's window to the unseen, stood empty and still. One afternoon, Lucy took a small bouquet of daisies and placed them at the well's edge. "She says thank you," she told David, "and she misses singing." David knelt beside her, watching the grass bend in the wind. He had solved hundreds of cases in his former life, but none like this. None that reached so deep, that demanded belief beyond evidence. He no longer questioned whether Margaret had been real, whether her voice had reached through time and sorrow, whether Lucy had spoken with her. Some truths weren't meant for courts. One evening, Emily confessed to hearing their son's voice less often. "It's like, he knows I'm not alone in it anymore," she whispered. David simply nodded. Their grief had not disappeared, but the weight of silence had lifted, if only slightly. On the last night before police formally cleared the scene, David returned to the porch. He stood under the same stars that had watched Margaret die. The paddocks rustled. The wind shifted. From far off, a single note echoed, brief, faint, like the tail end of a lullaby. David closed his eyes. In the dark, the land didn't haunt anymore, it breathed. The past, once buried, had finally spoken. And someone had listened.